this is the Provoked Prawn and this is the BeQuiet Light Base 600LX. In this video I'm going to show you how to build in this case and the things you need to know while doing so. I want to demonstrate the standard setup, so how to set it up like this with the pre-included fans and a 360mm all-in-one cooler. But I also want to go into some depth in other things, so if you want to do this and add in some extra fans to the bottom of the case, as well as swapping out the fans on the radiator for BeQuiet fans so that the system matches throughout, I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So stick with me as I go through all the different steps of doing this. I'll leave timestamps down below so you can jump to the relevant points in the video, as well as specs and more in the description that you might find useful too. But I want to start by breaking down the case and showing you the things of interest about it, talking about the highlights and the things that I discovered along the way while building in it that might be useful to you. Immediately, this case has some interesting highlights to it. The rear panel, for example, as you can see, is fully perforated, allowing for good airflow through there. You'll also spy in the four corners that there are these little rubber areas here. Now you can actually remove these and then swap the feet position on the case so you can lay it flat and have it run like that, which is pretty interesting. But I'm not going to show that in this setup. That I'll save for the review of the case. You can remove the top panel, which as you'll see has a nice dust filtering on it and is fairly solid as well. So there's some good filtering there to prevent dust ingress over time. The glass panel is removed by removing those thumb screws and then pulling and sliding out. Just be careful not to drop it on the desk, as I just did. But you'll see that there are some runds in it that run along the case and help you re-secure it later on. Also note there's protective film both on the inside and outside of the glass that you'll need to remove at some point once you've finished the build. Now you can also remove the front glass panel, which isn't necessary, but I wanted to show how to do it and also maybe access things a bit more easily during this video and show you from different angles the various things. But you can see a couple of screws top and bottom, and then that comes out. As said, it's not necessary for the build if you don't want to do it. The rear panel removes with the same sort of thumb screw logic and then just pulls out. And again, be careful not to keep smashing things into your desk, as I did when incompetent. But as you'll see, this rear panel also has a large dust filter on it, which can be removed. It is held in place with a couple of clips, so you have to sort of slide it over to the side, and then it can be popped out. Now this is nice because obviously if you're going to use that option to lay this flat on the desk, this will stop it from sucking dirt in through the bottom. And it also is really easy to take this out and then to be able to clean it over time, so you're able to keep the PC nice and clean. So it's a nice feature of the case that you can do this, and then you can take that out. So you can see how easy that is to get out and then be able to access it, which is pretty nice. It's also labeled to say which way round it goes back in, so you can avoid confusion there. The other thing that's interesting and becomes useful later on is that you can remove the bottom panel. So you can see, we flip the case over so you can see the feet. You can unscrew the bottom of it and you can take the bottom off as well. Now this is useful because, once again, dust filtering down here, but also doing this means that you can then install the bottom fans when we get to that point later in the video, so you can easily do that. So you can see multiple angles, loads of dust filters, loads of easy areas to remove things from the case. Stripped down, there are also other things of interest worth looking at. Obviously it comes with 4 fans pre-installed and set up in there for you, and this is a pretty nice setup and useful as well. Now these 3 fans on the side are reverse blade fans, which means that you can see the fan blades here, but is still pulling air into the case as intake fans. These are mounted at the rear of the case with the bracketing and the wiring hidden at the back, but you'll notice they've got reversed written on them here. Now this is an unusual setup and a highlight to the case because it means things are nice and neat with the messier parts hidden away at the rear. There's a door here at the rear as well that you can see that you can move in and out, and that's secured there, and it has a lot of the cabling tied to it, and I'll show you more on that in a second. If you take a look at this area at the front, you'll see about the motherboard mounting index, so you can use different sizes of motherboard in here, including a rear connect motherboard. So I'm using an ATX rear connect motherboard in this build to make things nice and clean. You can do that, but you can use standard motherboards of varying sizes as well. At the rear, it's possible to remove this door, which also doubles as an SSD mounting tray. And I would recommend doing this to get it out of the way because it'll make life a lot easier. There's a screw at the top at the bottom, but if you just remove the one at the bottom, you can then lift the tray out. Just make sure you don't lose that screw in the process. The hard disk drive cage at the rear here can also be removed. I'd highly recommend removing this if you're not planning on using a hard disk drive on your system, because it will give you more space for cabling and for management of things. But I also realized that I was going to need to take this out in order to plug in the rear connect motherboard connections as well. There are 3 screws holding it in place, top, bottom, and then at the side there as well. And then the bracket just comes out, and the accessories box is in there, and that has all the different screws and other things that you're going to need for the build process. But you can see removing this can be handy in other ways, because it also reveals that down below there is a PWM fan repeater, which also allows for RGB connections. Now this is really cool and interesting, and a great inclusion to the case, because at the top and the bottom you've got these 2 repeaters, and they're plugged in and wired into the case at various points, and that's how the RGB lighting strips work around the whole thing. You'll see there's another one at the top here, and the fans that are installed in the case as standard are already plugged into it with 5V RGB connections and fan power connections for the front 3 fans and the rear single fan as well, all wired in already. Then you're just going to need SATA power and connections to the motherboard. Now, it is worth noting at this point that I decided to go about the process of cable tidying to make all these things neat, because they do come with little plastic ties on them, but if you want to tidy them up properly with proper cable ties, then you can, but don't do it yet, and I'll show you why in a second, because I made that mistake and then I came unstuck. Inside the accessories box are a number of things included in here that you can see laid out. We've got a power supply mounting bracket, which you need to install after the PSU is put in place. Then there's a couple of bits for vertically mounting your GPU, which I'm not going to be using here. But these 2 parts allow you to mount your graphics card in a different position if you've got the right riser cable. There's then an anti-sag bracket for your graphics card as well to secure it and help with the reduction of sag over time. And then 3 rubber areas which mount into the case. Now these are for hiding the cables away from the front and neatening things up. So there's 3 spots that they go into along the side of the case. The problem with them is, because the fan cables are already run through to the back and plugged into the controller, and at this point I'd also cable tied, as you can see, there's an issue because you can't put these in without first removing those fan cables. I don't know why they don't come installed as standard in the case, but that meant that I had to undo all my cable tidying that I'd already done, take those out, and then basically remove the cabling from the repeaters, so to unplug all the fans to be able to then run these cables through those rubber areas, and then to install them into the side of the case so they could neaten things up. It's a little bit of a faff and a weird quirk of the way they've designed it. I don't know why they didn't just install these for you as standard, since they've already wired the fans in. But maybe not everybody will want to use them. Also, we'll get to other issues that I had with these a bit later on. But as you can see, you're basically slotting those into place to hide these holes away at the side. And it does end up making it look a lot neater, so it is worth doing. But it does mean a bit of prep before you even start building, because you need to unplug all the cables for the fans, run them through these 3 little rubber areas and install each of those. So it's a little bit fiddly, but it's sort of pre-prep before building the case. And then obviously remembering to plug them back in to the repeater at the top, and then just repeat this process 3 times. If you're planning on using a rear connect motherboard, as I am, this is worth doing, because what it does is it hides away a lot of the cables, because obviously we've got the fan cables running through there, but otherwise you're not going to be running other cables through to the front. For example, the power cables that you'd normally run for your motherboard through from the power supply unit won't be going through to the front, so this really neatens things up. It doesn't give you much room for other things though, because one set of power cables obviously is going to include the graphics card power cables, and you still need to think about getting those through at some point as well. Later on in the build I'll show you that. But as you can see, these things are not very forgiving in how much room you have to run cables through them. So do have to think about that. I also want to point out that it is worth cable tidying after you've done this part. So obviously after we've put all of these in, what you want to do is to use the plastic cable ties to secure these cables down. Especially if you're like me and you're using a rear connect motherboard, because it would get these cables out of the way over the various ports that are going to be coming through from the front. Makes it easier to plug in other things, to see what you're doing, and also just to secure these cables down so they're not in the way and they're not making any contact with the motherboard that could cause problems. You'll find there are various different areas that you can run the cable ties through to secure these down. So you've got these little hoops sticking out at the rear that you can run them into. There isn't a great deal of space, as you can see, for cable management though. There's not a load of channeling, for example, to run them through. So you really do have to make sure you're securing them in various spots as much as possible, tying cables to cables and tying cables to those hoops as well, basically securing them along the edge there, as you can see what I've done with the fan cables. More on that in a second though. For now, we're going to go about the motherboard prep. This is a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Stealth Ice motherboard, rear connect AMD motherboard, which is obviously very handsome. And yes, it's white, so maybe you might not like that with a black case, but I thought it would be a nice addition to this build because it's not only good looking, but it also has a setup that includes the screw holes for the motherboard hidden under various panels. And obviously, rear connect motherboard means that you can hide away a lot of other things at the rear too. It's got a decent amount of I/O on it and has Wi-Fi 7, but it does lack USB-C ports. There's only one, which is one thing of note. For this build, I'm also using a Samsung 9100 Pro NVMe SSD. It of course has Dominator titanium RAM and a Ryzen 7 9800X3D CPU, as well as a few other things that you'll see. At the top, along the edges here, you'll see that just popped off because there is basically a magnetic cover hiding away the screw holes, both on the top, right and left of the motherboard, and other things too going on, which I'll show you in a second. Now I'm going to show you the installation of the CPU and other bits. Obviously, if you already know how to do this, you can skip forward using the timestamps down below. But what we want to do is lift that little lever, lift the hatch up, then gently seat the CPU down into the socket. You'll notice there's little notches at the top and the bottom of it line up with the plastic bits in the socket there. Carefully seat it down, being very careful not to bend the pins, and then re-secure this. At this point, I'm going to set it up with Galahad 2 360 performance bracketing from Lian. So as standard, the motherboard comes with these white clips above and below the CPU socket that we need to remove. So you take those out and remove those because we're going to replace them with the brackets that come with the Galahad 2 cooler, which I'm going to do a separate wiring and setup guide on, but I'm going to show you how to install it in this build as well. The first stage of that is prepping the motherboard. I like to do this now so that it's easy to do and easy to see. You could technically do this when the motherboard's mounted in the case if you prefer, but you need to make sure the bracketing faces this way so that the parts for it are facing inwards, as you can see, closer towards the CPU, and then you reuse the screws that we just took out to secure this bracket down into those standoff holes around the top and bottom of the CPU socket. The idea of this is going to hold the cooler down when you get to the stage of installing that and allow you to secure it nicely over the top of the CPU. And I'll show you the setup for that a bit later on in the video, but it's doing this prep now makes life a lot easier for the full build. Next up, I want to show you the removal of this top M2 NVMe heatsink. So you can take this off. You can see it's a chunky heatsink. So if you're using an NVMe up here, which requires it, I'd recommend using that because it will help keep things running nice and cool. If you're using multiple NVMe's, you can also remove this shielding down the bottom, which you can see is held in place with a clip and a couple of magnets. And then below that shielding, there is ports for a couple more M2 NVMe SSDs, so you can install some more PCIe drives down there. Also removing this, you'll see the 3 screw holes at the bottom of the motherboard for securing it into the case as well. You'll see I'm now installing an NVMe SSD without a sticker on. Don't do that, don't take the sticker off. This is an old drive that I used for a separate video that I'll link to in the description on how you shouldn't remove stickers from your drives. It does still work though, but what you should do is remove stickers from the thermal pads on the heat shield before you put it back in place, because that will help it run cool. As said, you could put 2 drives down there in theory, and then another one at the top. That top slot will obviously give you the best performance, especially with that heatsink. But in this instance, I'm using Samsung's 9100 Pro, which comes with its own heatsink. And I think, generally speaking, it's better to use built-in heat sinks that are supplied directly by the manufacturer rather than motherboard ones where possible, because they're going to vary wildly from motherboard to motherboard. And Samsung's obviously worked to make sure this will give you good performance and temperatures in the build as well. So we're going to install it in the top slot, which is a Gen 5 NVMe SSD slot. So this should run at its maximum speeds, and then secure it in place by using that little clip at the edge there just to slide it over and hook it into place. Now onto the RAM installation. Using Corsair's Dominator Titanium RAM, you need to make sure you install it in the 2nd and 4th slot. This is DDR5 RAM, and to make sure your PC runs properly and works with XMP, you need slot 2 and slot 4. So put your RAM in there. It can only slot in one way. If you try and put it in the other way around, it won't fit, and secure that down. Next, we're going to secure the motherboard into the case using these screws, which, as you can see, have a hexagonal top to them, similar to what you'd use for the power supply unit, and these are what you'd use to secure the motherboard in this instance. So carefully putting that down into the case. Obviously the ports are going to the rear, and then remove the various panels. So you can see that plastic one that I removed at the top there. We then secure it with multiple screws, 2 across the middle, 3 across the top. So first of all, where I remove that magnetic area at the top there, and then there's another clip on the left hand side to access the 3rd screw hole on the far left hand side. So you can do that, and then obviously you can pop those covers back on so we can hide that away and keep things nice and neat. And that's one of the nice things about this stealth board, is a lot of things are hidden and it just looks really clean. And then again, you need to remove that NVMe heat shield panel down the bottom as well, so that you can secure the motherboard down there with 3 additional screws running across the bottom and securing it nicely in that instance, and then just pop that back on, and that's fully set up there. So pretty straightforward in terms of the motherboard installation, and then the wiring for that's all at the back, obviously, so we can neaten things up there. So I want to show you first of all the connections from the case. This includes USB-A and USB-C cables that you can see here for the front panel. You'd see them on a standard motherboard on the right-hand side, just below the 24-pin power cable. So the USB-A port is this one, which, as you can see, has a little plastic notch on it, as does the cable. And you want to plug that in and push it in until it's fully seated in there. USB-C can also go in one way only, so you need to make sure it's in the right direction and then it clicks when you push it in. For the rear connector motherboard, obviously this setup is slightly different. You'll find these connections over on the left-hand side at the rear, and you can see them marked here. So USB-C, USB-A, and these ports on the edge there. I want to show you both sorts of motherboard connections throughout this video, so it's easy for you, because I'm aware not everyone's going to want to use a rear connect motherboard. You might be using a standard motherboard, but as you can see, plugging these in at the rear is fairly easy to do. But you do then need to think about tidying the cables up a bit more, because obviously there's a lot of slack here, with the normal setup being to run them through to the front. So I started cable tidying at this point, and I did have a bit of a problem that I want to highlight for you in a minute. So just take care in cable tidying, and I'll show you why in a second. But it is worth doing to try and neaten things up so that we can access the other ports. These include the front panel connection for the power button and the HD audio connection for the 3.5mm. On a standard motherboard, HD audio plugs in at the bottom left of the motherboard. You'll notice there's a missing pin in that connector, so the plug will only go in one way and seat in there. On a rear connect motherboard, because it's flipped, obviously it's on the right hand side of the rear instead. You can see it's marked F audio in this instance. So the cable runs across to the right there and plugs in there. But again, from another angle, you'll see there's a missing pin, so you have to watch out for that when you go to plug it in. And then we've got an excess of cable that once again needs to be tidied up. But this is actually a mistake doing that, so I'll show you why in a second, so watch out for that. Then you've got the front panel connection, which is for your power and reset button, and as you can see, this port is actually quite wide. Only one side of it is for that power and reset button. So if you look at your manual or look closely at the description on the motherboard, you can see what the bits of these section are for. And again, there's a pin missing, so it's actually impossible to put it in the wrong way around and into the wrong area. So just line that up and plug that in. On the rear connector motherboard, it's on the left hand side there, so just secure that now and tidy later. I'll show you why in a second. Next up, I'm going to install the power supply unit. In this case, we're using the NZXT C1200 Gold. I want to show you the wiring for each of the different things depending on what you're going to be using. We're going to start with the 24-pin motherboard power connections. So this cable is split into 2 parts on the power supply end, which you can see is marked motherboard 20+4. By the way, the logic for this installation and this modular power supply is basically the same across other PSUs as well, so you should find it's pretty straightforward, and you can watch this and still follow along with your chosen power supply. But you can see you can run the 24-pin power cable on a standard motherboard over to the right-hand side, and that's where it will plug in there. Obviously, once it's installed in the case, I'm just letting you see it like this from this angle so it's easier to see. There's a clip down one side that needs to hook over a little plastic notch on the port itself, so make sure that's pushed all the way in and hooks over there once it's in the case, otherwise it might not power on properly. Then you have two 8-pin CPU power cables which are clearly marked CPU on one end. These are designed to plug into the motherboard on the top left of the motherboard and supply additional power that you might need. Now, you might not need two cables on your motherboard of choice. You might need just one, but one end of those, the end that isn't marked CPU, plugs into the CPU and PCIe ports on the power supply end. So you can see you can plug those in, and you can see there's a little hook that pushes in place there and secures down nicely. On a standard motherboard, these two cables would then plug into the top left corner of the motherboard on an ATX board. So you can see this Gigabyte board, they plug in at the top left there with the black connectors. Similar logic to the 24-pin power connector, they have a little plastic clips on them, so you need to make sure they're pushed all the way in. Now, people often ask me whether they should use these. If you have the cables and you have the ports, plug them in. You definitely should. It will help with making sure your system will run better, especially if you're doing overclocking and other things, but it's worth doing. Just secure those and you won't have any issues there. The other thing to note is that the cable can be broken apart on one of these connectors. So what you might find is that your motherboard doesn't require two 8-pins, but instead requires one 4-pin perhaps. And you can see that you can split these cables in half. You can often do this with different power supply units, where one of the CPU power cables can be halved. So this can be handy. You can see this NZXT motherboard, for example, requires one 8-pin CPU power connector and then one 4-pin. And that's how you would do that. Just split the cables, plug them in at the top left there, and that's how you get that connection. Again, don't forget, obviously, do this once the motherboard's installed in the case and the power supply is. I just want to make it really easy for you to see what's what as we go through this. So that's the standard setup for powering your motherboard, how it be set up with the 24-pin and the two 8-pin power cables. Now for SSDs and hard disk drives and the wiring of those, you will then need the SATA cables, which as you can see here, have one connection on one end that plugs into the power supply, and then these flat connectors throughout, multiples of these with little L-shaped connectors on them. Now in this instance we've got two of those cables included with the power supply. We might not need that many. It depends if you're even using these sorts of drives or sticking to NVMe SSDs. And that's the good thing about modular power supplies. You only need to plug in what you're actually going to be using. If you are going to be using these sorts of drive, plug this cable into the peripheral and SATA port on the bottom left here. Plug that in, and then at the other end, you plug them into the SSDs and hard disk drives when mounting them into the case, which I'll show you where these mount later on and how to sort those out. But you'll notice that there's a little L shape, a little notch on the connector, so they can only be plugged in one way for powering them. But because it's a daisy chain cable with multiple connectors on it, you can actually connect multiple things to it rather than having to have several cables. So we can put two drives on here really easily, for example. So you can put both these crucial SSD drives onto this connector and still power them both really easily as well. Just watch out for how that plugs in to make sure they're both plugged in the right way around. You can't do it the wrong way around, but it is a little bit fiddly if you try and plug it in the wrong way. So just watch out for that when you're going about that installation. Platter hard drives can also be installed using the same power cable, so you can set those up nice and easily. And then you need data cables, which are included with your motherboard, the SATA cables that plug into the SSDs and then plug into the motherboard on the right hand side. This will then allow for the data transfer, so obviously important, and each of these has a separate cable that needs to be plugged in on these right hand side ports that you can see here. As said, you should find those cables included with your motherboard to be able to plug those drives in, and you do this at the end of the build when setting these up and installing them. I want to show you where to mount these various different drives in the case and where to plug these cables into the rear connect motherboard as well later on. So it's slightly different there, obviously, with that setup. And now we're on to the graphics cards. So this power supply comes with 3 PCIe power connectors. I'm going to start by demoing what you do with an RTX 3090 that you'll see here. Now, one end for the power cable is marked PCIe, and you can see it split. So you've got a 6-pin and 2 additional pins that you need to pinch together when plugging into the graphics card. The other end plugs into the power supply unit on the ports marked PCIe and CPU. So bottom right here, for example, plug those in. And obviously you need to plug in as many cables as you've got. So this GPU requires 3. The GPU I'm actually using in the build only needs 2. So work out how many cables you're going to need before plugging these sorts of cables in. That way you're only plugging in what you need and you don't have additional cables in your case making a mess. But with these connectors, they're a little bit fiddly to plug in on the graphics card end, because you can see they need to be pinched together to make sure they're in that 8-pin setup. And it's a little bit fiddly because there's a plastic clip at the end of them that needs to be secured. And then you need to push it into the port. And again, there's a little plastic notch on that port where your clip hooks over the top of it and secures it down. But you do need to make sure that all the parts of the cable are fully pushed in. Both cables are connected up to the graphics card there. As you can see, 2 separate cables. If you've got a GPU with 3 cables, then you can use the third one. Alternatively, you might have one of the more recent NVIDIA GPUs. You can use this 12-volt high power connector instead, which is 600-watt connector at both ends. So one end plugs into the power supply unit, as you can see here. Notice how this plugs in. Make sure it's fully seated all the way in, pushed all the way in, so it's clicked into place. You need to make sure with these power cables especially that they're fully seated, because there's a lot of power potentially going through there, especially if you're using a high-end GPU like a 5090, for example. That needs to be fully secured in there. And then the other end, instead of using the horrible power adapter that you usually get with your GPU, you can use that cable. So this is a 4070 Ti from Gigabyte, which, as you can see, comes with this adapter as standard that allows you to plug in 2 8-pin PCIe power cables into this port on the GPU. But instead of doing that, you could remove that and just use the 12-volt high power cable instead. So that plugs directly into the GPU. Just make sure it's pushed all the way in and fully seated in there. So now you know which power cables you're going to be using, hopefully. You can then just plug in the cables that you're going to require into the modular power supply unit, and that way you haven't got excess, but also you don't have the fiddle of trying to plug these cables in once you've installed everything else into the case, because it does become a little bit tricky to do otherwise. You can still access it pretty easy in this case, I'll be honest, but it still makes life easier because you don't have to try and figure out which ports are which or try and see the markings from a strange angle. So just suss out what drives you're going to be using, how many power cables you're going to need, and only plug in the ones that you're actually going to be using, and then you can install the power supply in the case. So in this instance, it seats at the back here. Make sure the fan is facing outwards towards the rear of the case, because that's how it pulls air into it to cool it down. It then secures with those same screws that I showed you for the motherboard at the back there, 4 screws into the 4 corners that you can see on this bracket, and secure that down to make sure it's fully held in place there. And then there's this additional bracket that came in the accessories box, which you can see is padded on one side, and that secures to the case and holds the power supply in place. So if you're planning on using the options that you have of installing the feet at a different position, for example, it will make sure that the power supply is secured nicely there anyway, no matter what you're doing. So it's an additional one that you need to screw in there and secure that down, but then that holds the power supply properly, so it makes it nice and easy. So as a reminder for plugging in the power cables, this is how it looks on the rear connect motherboard. So you can see in this instance it only has one 24-pin power connector and one 8-pin CPU power connector. They're in different positions now because we're looking at the back of the motherboard instead. So the 24-pin power cable plugs in on the left-hand side. Make sure, again, that that's fully pushed all the way in when you're doing this. And then the 8-pin CPU power connector plugs in the top right. Notice with this motherboard, there's only one of those. You might have more on yours depending on what you're using. But that's the standard setup for the powering of the motherboard. So we're going to start doing that now, plugging those cables in. But I want you to be able to see easily, because it's a bit difficult to see with some of the shadows here where that would plug in. So we can run this cable up to the top and plug it in there. Now this is why it's important to cable tidy earlier on with the fan cables, to make sure that they were all out of the way of these various ports. You'll see there's not a great deal of places to run these cables, and they are quite thick. So trying to make sure they're plugged in and then also out of the way of other cables we're going to be plugging in later on can be important. You'll notice there are some loops along the edge here just behind where the fans are sitting. So we can secure the cables to that, and I would recommend doing that with the power cables. But you do need to make sure, obviously, they're not going to interfere with the fans and the airflow at this point. So make sure it's secured nicely across those various different points in the case there. So I'm doing it with this 8-pin CPU power connector. Plug that in and then secure the cables down. And then the 24-pin power cable plugs in on the left-hand side, as you can see it here. So make sure that's pushed in and push it until you feel it click into place fully. And then obviously tying this cable down as well. This cable's a bit more problematic because it's quite thick. So you do need to make sure it's secured nicely there. Now I'd recommend also plugging in the SATA power connections. Now both the top and bottom fan controllers require powering, which is the flat SATA power connection, is the same as you use for the SSDs and hard disk drives. You need to make sure these are plugged in so that all the fans will work, but also the RGB lighting strips across the top and side and bottom and the outside of the case as well. So make sure you plug in both of those power cables, and then I'll show you where to plug in the other parts from those repeaters in a minute, but that's important that you do that. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier on is the tidying of the cables up and how this caused a problem. So you can see that I've secured cables down to the back of the case here, but then when I went to reinstall the hard drive cage, or at least plan this out, I realized this was going to be a problem because where I'd secured those cables, the cage is then going to get in the way, pinching the cables down or causing an issue. So not ideal. What I then ended up doing was moving the cables down and securing them below the motherboard instead. Now this isn't an issue if you're not going to be using the hard drive cage, but because I wanted to demonstrate how to do it for you, I ended up having to move these cables out of the way. But it's something to think about when securing the cables. If you are going to be cable tidying, you'll see that that could be a problem if you also want to use this, because this bracket mounts down there and secures in that position, as you can see at that point there, which would then squash cables or get in the way of the others. If you're not using the cage, I'd recommend getting rid of it entirely, because it would just give you more room for managing cables and neatening things up back there. This cage is exclusively just for installing hard disk drives in it. You can only install one as standard. You have to buy an additional bracket if you want to install an additional one into it. How it works is you take the little rubber washers that you can see here. So you've got a bunch of those, and they go into the holes on the cage itself. So you have to push them in. It is quite fiddly. Basically push them in from one side until they pop into place, and secure those across the various different ports there. So you can see there's 6 included as standard, but you actually need 4, or I only need 4 for my drive. So just lining up the screw holes on the drive with that, making sure it's facing in the right direction, obviously with the ports facing towards the left, so you can plug them in for the power cables and data connections later on. Then use these longer screws to go through those rubber holes and secure into the screw holes for the hard disk drive, and then to be able to mount this. So just tightening those up and securing them down. So obviously this allows for installation of a hard disk drive if you want to use it. You don't have to use this one, and might not be used by most people in modern builds, but if you do want to, you can do that. You can see there is still space underneath it for cables. If you wanted to run cables through and hide them behind, you could do that once this is in place, and it might actually hide things away quite nicely. The way it works is it basically hooks in on the right hand side and then slots down, and then obviously you have to get those screws that we removed earlier on to secure it back down, screwing at the top and the bottom and on the left hand side to secure it to the various points that it came out of, and then that's sorted. But as you can see, it takes up quite a lot of space down here, so not using it is optimal for improving the cable management. Then you use the SATA power cables to plug those in, and then the SATA data cable plugs in there, and then plugs into the motherboard. So the SATA cables plug in on the left-hand side near where the USB-C port is. You can see there's 4 on this rear connect motherboard, plugs in on the left-hand side there. With a standard motherboard, it would run through to the front and plug in on the right-hand side as a reminder. If you're using SSDs as an alternative, then you need some other different rubber washers which stick out a bit further, and they mount onto that door that we removed earlier on from the case. So you can install 2 SSDs onto this. You need 4 of these rubber washers per drive. So put all 8 in if you're using 2 drives as I am. And then what you want to do is to take these sort of standoff screws that you can see, taller screws, screw into 4 screw holes on the SSDs. So you have to screw into each of the 4 corners. And what this does is these then push into the rubber washers that we just put on the door. And that way the drive is held in place, but it isn't actually screwed in with a screwdriver as we did with the hard disk drive. Instead, it's just pushed into place. It's pretty easy. It's a nice and easy installation. And because it's mounted to that door, they're also hidden away. They're really easy to wire in as well. And it's a lot less faff than the hard disk drive installation. So you basically just line those up with the rubber washers and push them in. Notice how I'm pushing it in as well with the ports facing upwards towards the middle of the door for one of the drives and downwards for the other drive, and that way the cables can be plugged in the middle of it. So if you take the SATA data connections, for example, we'll plug those in here. Notice the metal bit is visible because that's how you plug that in, and then you'll be able to remove those cables because there's this little clip that you can just touch and push to be able to pull those out. And then that'll plug in on the right hand side of your motherboard if you're using a standard motherboard, as I said, or on the left hand side on the rear connect motherboard when viewed from the rear. Now onto the all-in-one cooler setup. So this is the Lian Galahad 2 Lite, the 360mm all-in-one cooler, which works nicely in this build. Now I'm initially going to show you how to set it up with the standard pre-installed fans, because this is actually really easy to do. So if you're not planning on adding extra fans into your case and you just want to use the standard case fans and then this, you can do that really easily. It's actually a very easy system to install as well. You'll see there are 2 cables coming out of the pump, one for 5-volt RGB header and one for AIO pump header connection. I'll show you in a second. And then you've got fans daisy chained together on the radiator with one single connection, which I'd recommend plugging into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. And that way, that will help nicely cool your system. So to demo this outside the case, you can see 2 cables running from the pump. Plug those in to the ports on your motherboard. Now you can see we've got CPU fan and AIO pump header connections. Sometimes both of them are at the top. On this motherboard, it's down on the bottom right for some reason. But I'd recommend plugging the pump into the AIO pump header, and then the fans on the radiator into CPU fan, and then obviously the 5-volt RGB connection onto the 3-pin connector on your motherboard. Or alternatively, you could plug that into the fan controller, and I'll show you that in a little while as well. So we're mounting this to the top of a case as standard because it's the easiest to install with all the other fans already in place. Use the small screws that are included with the radiator to secure it into the various points along the top there. You can see we're lining up the radiator with the various holes and securing it in. Now I'm making this set up so that the tubes for the radiator are on the right hand side because I just think that looks neater. You could put them the other way around on the left, although you do need to think about the interference potentially with that rear exhaust fan at the back of the case. But I'd recommend basically securing this down in this position nice and tight so it's well secured, but you do have to make sure obviously that it's all lined up nicely while you're doing it. Then run the fan power cable from the fans mounted on the radiator through to the rear and try and tidy that up as much as possible. Luckily with this setup, these fans are daisy chained together, so there's only one cable to worry about, so it's really easy to keep neat and tidy, which is definitely a benefit. And I'll show you where to plug that in a second as a reminder. But what we're going to do is to mount the cooler like this. I'm also going to use the AMD thermal paste guard from Noctua that you can see here. I've got a separate video on this, but essentially it just notches around the outside of the Ryzen CPU, just places down over the top of that. And you can keep it in place once you put your cooler down on top. But the idea here is to basically stop thermal paste from seeping over the edges of your CPU and going down into those gaps around the CPU itself. It just keeps things nice and tidy and avoids any issues with overspill. So we'll then put some thermal paste down onto the CPU, and I personally like to spread it out over the IHS across the top of the CPU, making sure there's good even coverage across the top there. Now this is a little bit fiddly to do, and some people would prefer just to put a dot in the middle. Also, Lian supplies a different way of doing this included in the box, but I personally prefer this. As long as you've got a good coverage across it, it should be fine to then install your CPU cooler down over the top of this. It's making sure it's nice and neat with no massive lumps and no gaps on it, and then it will be squashed down in a second by the cooler anyway, and that'll make sure you've got good contact and good cooling there. Don't forget though to remove the little plastic cover over the copper plate before seating the cooler down. So this cooler then seats down over the brackets that we installed earlier on the motherboard, so onto those standoff brackets, and then you secure it down by screwing the screws down and using a screwdriver. Go corner to corner, so top right to bottom left, for example, and then bottom right to top left, securing each of these, and make sure they're tightened all the way up, and so you can't tighten them any further basically until they've stopped, but don't like overly force it, just until they stop and they won't go any further. So don't be too rough with it, but that'll make sure it's nicely secured there. Then there's some little bit of plastic film on both the Lian logo and the bit below this that you need to peel off to make sure that the mirror effect is visible. Obviously taking care not to get fingerprints all over it while doing so. I probably did that in the wrong order, but I've managed to avoid it, and it looks pretty nice in this setup. And then run those other cables through to the rear. Now, because this uses AIO pump header and 5-volt RGB, we can set this up so the motherboard can control the lighting, and you'll be able to get it to sync if you do that with the BeQuiet fans that are installed in the case and with the case lighting as well. And I'll show you that later on in Windows. But you're basically running these cables through to the rear. So as a reminder, the AIO pump header, I'd recommend plugging into the AIO header. The fans themselves plug into the CPU fan header, which you can see marked here in the middle of these three, which is in the top left. And then the AIO pump on this motherboard is sysfan pump, which is down there just below the 24-pin power connector. And then you've got the 5-volt RGB cable, which you can run through and plug in. So you also have this cable coming from the fan controller, because that needs to be plugged in there as well. So that plugs into the motherboard, and then you can sync the RGB lighting up for this full system. So you're looking for a 3-pin 5-volt RGB connector, which you can see here is marked D-LED1, for example. And on a standard motherboard, once again, you can see the sysfan 4 pump, which is the AIO pump header on the motherboard there. Once you've done that, you should find that you can then turn the system on, and the RGB lighting will light up on the standard fans on the case and hopefully on the cooler as well. And the good thing about this case is the RGB lighting is controllable from the case itself as well as from the motherboard software. Now stick with me in a minute, because I'm going to show you how to swap out the fans on the radiator with BeQuiet fans and additional fans down the bottom if you want to do this. But if you want a basic setup and a basic build for your system, that's the majority of what you need, because you can then obviously just throw your graphics card in and you've got a pretty good PC build there. The top button on the right hand side that you can see me pressing here, if you press and hold it, it goes between two modes. Either one where you can control the RGB lighting switch in different modes, you see a button press will switch between different modes for the fans, or you can press and hold it again and put it into motherboard sync, where it will sync with the motherboard software, so that you can then control everything from your motherboard software, which in this case would be Gigabyte Control Center. But we'll look at that later on. For now, we're going to install the graphics card, which in this case is an ASRock Steel Legend, which is an Intel B580 GPU that I'm using in this build. As you can see, it's a reasonably compact card and fairly easy to install in this system. We need to install it on the top slot and a PCIe slot on the motherboard, which in this case is only one of it accessible anyway, but if you're using a different motherboard, make sure you use the top slot for the maximum speed. Then we'll remove the brackets at the rear of the case, unscrewing the screws there. Now hold on to those screws because we'll need them again in a second. Remove those brackets, and then secure the GPU into the socket, push it down until it clicks into place, and then re-secure it with those screws on the left-hand side, screwing them into the back of the case, and that will hold it in place there. In a second, I'll show you how to use the anti-sag bracket as well for this, because you want to make sure you're making the most of that to ensure your GPU doesn't sag over time. Basically, we're securing it at one end, but the other end, especially if you've got a larger card or a longer one, might well weigh down over time. So the anti-sag bracket that I showed you earlier on secures to a screw hole on the right-hand side. So you need to screw it in there, and then basically you can adjust it up and down so it pushes on the bottom of the GPU and helps to secure it. Then we run the two 8-pin PCIe power cables from the power supply through to the front. Now these are quite difficult to get through because you have to run them through those rubber washers that I showed you earlier on, which is quite a small gap to run these cables through. So you have to manipulate them through carefully without pushing those rubber things out of the holes that we put them into earlier on, and running the cables through there. So there's not a great deal of space for running these cables, but most of the stuff's hidden at the rear anyway. Then pinch the PCIe power cables together as I showed you earlier. Make sure they're held together nicely, and then push them into the ports. These are a little bit fiddly to do, and you do need to make sure they are both secured nicely in there. The other thing is that you'll see the cables are dangling down and could be a bit problematic. So maybe a tie to neaten them up. I actually ended up using a bit of rubber to hold them together further down to tidy things up a little bit, because most of the cables are hidden obviously with the rear connect motherboard, and yet obviously we need these GPU power cables coming through to the front, and they're not as hidden, so you might want to try and work out a way to make them look a little bit nicer. They're quite thick cables on this one as well, but you could tie them together just below the graphics card and they won't be as visible perhaps if you do that. So you could tie them at the rear there and secure those down. You might want to do a test boot at this point to make sure it's all working properly still, so we can see the RGB lighting on the graphics card so we know it's getting power and everything's set up as it should be. Next onto the SSDs. So I'm putting the door back on with the SSDs that I mounted to it earlier on. Obviously popping it into the top screw that was there and then re-securing the bottom screw. You can see how much easier this is without that mounted initially, so you've got room to cable tie and put everything in. And then obviously with it back in place, we can put the power cables into the SSDs and the data cables as well. So with the daisy chainable cables, we can run those, plug them into the top drive and the bottom drive from the same cabling there. There's also a loop on this door, so if you wanted to tidy these cables up a bit more, you could do that at this point as well. So you could tie those cables down if you felt like it was necessary, but I didn't think that it actually needed to, so it was fine. You don't really need to bother if you don't want to. It is all going to be hidden behind this door nicely. So we'll then run those cables through and plug them into the SATA ports on the left-hand side of the bottom of the motherboard there, and make sure that they're connected up so that they've got the data being sent through. And then once that's done, you can just close the door. Now, obviously, it's a little bit tight. It does keep popping back up, but you can get it shut. And then when you've got the actual door back on at the rear as well with the venting, then it's not an issue. So I hadn't gone overboard with the cable management, and yet it's still possible to close the door up quite nicely. So that shouldn't be an issue. Pretty nice there. And then you can peel off the plastic film on the glass before resecuring that front panel. Well, you might not have taken yours out, but don't forget to remove that plastic from the inside of it. Otherwise, it won't look as nice once you've set it up and have it running on your desk. And then the side panel also has a plastic film that you need to remove from the inside. And there's also one on the outside as well that you saw me remove at the beginning of the video. And then install that back on as well, securing that into place there. Push it across, so slide it on and push it to the right, and then secure it with the thumb screws at the rear. And then obviously the top panel also needs to go back on as well, popping that down and securing that into place. Now I've shown you all this, and this is the standard installation, how to set your case up so it looks like this. Obviously with the pre-installed fans as basic and just the all-in-one cooler with its fans as it is. And I'm going to do a review to show you the performance of this and what it's like versus the things I'm going to show you in a second, which is adding in additional fans to the bottom and also swapping out the fans on the radiator for BeQuiet fans. Because if you want to put the same sort of RGB lighting throughout, and that's a nice way of doing it. I have found, however, that the airflow is pretty decent in this setup as standard, and I'll show that in the review, so check that out if you want to find out more. But I bought some additional Lightwings LX fans. It's worth noting that sadly you can't get reverse blade fans. You don't seem to be able to purchase them at this time, so these are standard blade fans. I'm going to show you the wiring logic for them and how to set them up, because we're going to use 2 lots of these in different positions in the case, obviously. These fans have what looks like 3 cables coming out of them, but it's actually 2 connectors and then 1 daisy chain cable for the RGB, so you can connect the RGB lighting from one fan to the next. So you'll see on the left, we've got this male RGB cable with pins in it, and then on the right hand side, on my right hand, I've got a 5-volt connection and the system fan connector. So the way this works is essentially what you're going to do is just basically use the male RGB connection to connect to the 5-volt RGB connector of the next fan in the group. We're going to use 3 fans here, obviously on the radiator, and another 3 fans on the bottom of the case as well. So by connecting up the RGB lighting, daisy chaining those together, you can then connect them to the fan hub in the case or directly to the motherboard. I'd recommend using the fan hub because that means you can then get the lighting to sync up with the RGB on the case strips and use that button that I showed you earlier as well, so you can control everything really nicely. So plug in the male connector from one fan to the next fan, and then the next fan, use the male connector on that to plug into the next fan's RGB connector as well. And then obviously at the end of that group, you can then plug in the 5-volt connection. So usually with these sorts of fans, you've got 2 connectors, the 5-volt connector and the fan power connector, both of which need to be connected to the motherboard, which means 6 cables need to be dealt with. But if you plug them together like this, you only need to plug in 1 RGB connector and then 3 fan power connectors. So it's fairly straightforward to do this setup. Now I'm going to use these 3 fans to mount them to the radiator in place of the pre-installed fans. Obviously, to do this, I'm going to remove the radiator by uninstalling the screws and then just removing it. But if you want to do this sort of logic, you could do this beforehand, before installing the radiator into the system. You just remove the standard fans and put your BeQuiet fans on there instead. Now, there is a risk of reducing the cooling performance because obviously these fans are designed specifically for this and they are performance fans. But obviously they don't have any RGB lighting, and if you want uniform RGB throughout the case, you might want to do the same. So remove the standard radiator screws that are installed on there, undo them all, and then just pull the fans off. What you want to do is then to reuse those fan screws, so just take them out of the fans, then place your fans onto the rad, make sure they're facing the same way, so the fan blades need to be facing towards you because they're going to face down into the case, and make sure that the cabling is running so it runs towards the back of the case when you put the radiator back into the case, so same direction as it was before. Then make sure the 5-volt connections from each of the fans is connected together, as I said, so all 3 of those fans are daisy chained in terms of the RGB lighting. Obviously, we've got a lot more cables to deal with when doing it like this instead of using the performance fans where there was just 1 cable to worry about. We've now got a lot more cables, so it is making things more complicated. I'd also recommend tying the cables together. If you cable tie once they're connected up, you can just neaten these up. If we use multiple ties along the cables, this will make life a lot easier when you're running the cables to the rear and then trying to connect them up as well. Because obviously there's a lot of mess of cables here. Otherwise, you've got a lot of cables running from the fans that you've got to try and manage through the back of the case. And because we've made such an effort to make things neat at the front, we don't want to ruin it with all these cables hanging down from the rear of the fans. And then make sure you clip off the excess plastic from the cable ties to get rid of that as well, so you can keep things nice and neat. And then we're going to go about reinstalling the radiator into the case. Obviously trying to run those cables through to the rear first of all. You can see what a difference this makes by cable tidying, because now it's much easier to run those through and basically hide them away. But there's still quite a lot of faff and fiddle to try and get them through the hole at the rear there. And then remounting the radiator to the top now and securing it back the way it was. So we're going to basically just use those little screws to screw it back into the top of the case and re-secure it up here. Exactly the same logic, but now we've just got different fans mounted on the radiator instead of the original fans. So the next step is then to basically connect those up again. This is a bit more complicated as mentioned, because now we've got this mess of cables to deal with. So obviously we've got the fan power connections. We've also got the 5-volt connector. Now, I'd recommend connecting the 5-volt RGB connection to that top fan controller. If you plug it into there, then you'll be able to control the RGB lighting of the fans on the radiator using that front button on the case that I showed you earlier on. It means it will sync up with the other RGB lighting from the other BeQuiet fans in the case as well. So it's really easy to set up that way. Now, I also recommend getting your hands on a splitter for the fan power connection. So you can see you've got this 3-way splitter. You can buy these separately pretty easily. What this means is that you can then plug in 3 power cables from 3 fans into it on one end, and then the other end just plugs into the motherboard. The reason for this is using this then allows you to plug all 3 fans into the CPU fan header on the motherboard, so we can achieve the same logic that we had before, so that all the fans on the all-in-one cooler are controlled by your motherboard. They're plugged into the CPU fan header, and that way the motherboard will then spin those up faster to make sure that the fans are running fast to cool the coolant down inside to keep your CPU cool. These plug into the CPU fan header, and then the pump is still plugged into the AIO pump header, and that way everything on the all-in-one cooler is controlled by the motherboard and easily set up there. So don't forget, CPU fan header is in the middle here, as you can see on this motherboard, marked up there, but you usually find it in the top right on a standard ATX motherboard, and you should be able to plug it in quite easily there. But 3 fans are then being powered from that directly, and I think that's the best way of doing it. You could alternatively plug them into other headers or into the bottom fan repeater on the case, but I think it's preferable to plug them in this way because it makes sure the all-in-one cooler system is basically all set up and easily controlled. Then you can see the RGB lighting is now matching, and if I press and hold the button on the case, you can set it into the case mode instead, and then you can just change between the RGB lighting effects on the fans, and you'll see all the BeQuiet fans now match up in terms of the lighting there. If you want to install 3 more fans on the bottom of the case, you can do that as well. So these are the same fans, the same BeQuiet Light Wings fans, and the same sort of logic in that I'm daisy chaining the RGB together. Technically, you could run these cables through to the rear and just plug them all into the repeater instead if you wanted to individually. But I like daisy chaining them up and then using the cable ties once again to make sure they're nice and tidy. The thing you'll find is at the bottom of the case is very limited room for running the cables through to the rear. And this is a little bit of an issue. So it's worth tightening these up and tidying them as much as possible with the same sort of logic. Now, we also need to make sure these are face down into the bottom of the case so that they're intake fans pulling air from below. So you don't want to install them face up. Sadly, we haven't got any reverse blade fans. If we did, those would go on the bottom quite nicely and you'd be able to see the fan blades. But we put them face down so the fan blades face downwards, and then it'll pull cold air from below. That way you've got 3 intake fans on the bottom and 3 on the side. So if you flip the case over so it's upside down, we then basically put the fans in like this, obviously with the fan cables at the back of this setup, and then screw them in from above. They will be screwed in using the fan screws that are included with the fans themselves, and you then just basically securing them to this bracket. Notice obviously that I've had to remove the bottom bracket from the case where the feet are in order to be able to access this, so you can screw the fans in and secure them there. And you're basically screwing those across that area, and then you need to run the cables from them through to the rear, which is the fiddly part because there isn't much space in order to be able to do that. So once that's done, then re-secure the feet in the bottom of the case, and then we need to run the cables through. Now what I did was run it into the bottom port near where I put the GPU power cables through to the back. But there isn't a great deal of room here, so it is a little bit fiddly to do, which is why it's important to neaten these things up. Then once we're at the rear, obviously we're sorting these cables out. Now you can use the bottom fan repeater for both the fan power connections and for the 5-volt RGB connector as well. And then when that's set up, you should find that when you power it back on, all the fans are now working with the same RGB lighting effect throughout. It's having some issues with the RGB lighting on the motherboard here. You can see the GPU is a different color, and the Corsair RAM was freaking out. But that's a video for later on, but you'll see that the RGB lighting in the case and all the fans are working nicely as well. So the RGB effects are at least the universal across those fans there. And so we can then go into Windows and sort that out and control it. So I'm going to show you the setup for Windows now, and then how to control the RGB lighting as well with the software. But hopefully you've seen a nice build that's been useful so far. Let me know down in the comments what you think. On a separate PC, search for Windows Creation Tool, and we're looking to create a Windows Media Creation Tool. And so go over to this website, and then you want this one, create a Windows 11 media installation. And then you open up the download, run the said download file. You need to have a separate USB stick for this, obviously, and a machine that you can do this on in the first place, although you can do this on a phone, and I've got a separate video about how to do that. And make sure you've got the right selections, and then you can see USB flash drive. It needs to be at least 8 GB, and then click there. You can see that I've got a USB drive already set for this and plugged into this machine. And then you're basically going to run this tool and until it progresses and does a Windows Media installation on that thumb drive. What you'll then do is insert that drive into the new PC. So pop that Windows installation media drive into your PC and then turn it on and wait for it to load. It should automatically boot from this drive, and then you'll find yourself in a Windows installation setup window that looks like this. What you want to do is then follow the on-screen instructions. Click I don't have a product key, unless you do, in which case you can put it in. Then select Windows 11 Home, and then read the terms and accept reliability there, and then click on custom Windows installation. Now you've got to choose which of the drives you want to use for your install. I'm going to use this Crucial BX drive, but you might choose to use the NVMe SSD, for example, that you had in there. You might have a multitude of drives to choose from. I'm going to format this drive as well. I'd recommend doing this. You might well find that you have to format the drive and delete any partitions that are already on it. So I'm using drive 0 in this instance. You can see it's got 2 different partitions. I had to delete both of them and format it so that it could then be used. So it's now an unallocated space. Click next, and then it will carry on with the copying of files on the installation process. This can take quite some time to go through, so I've sped up the process, but at some stage you should find that it will then say it's about to restart. At this point, what you want to do is to remove that USB drive from the system, otherwise it will reboot and try and carry on the process again. So essentially we put a lot of the files onto the PC already. You'll then find that it boots up. Now you might find you get to a point in the build now where you're trying to install Windows, but it won't work anymore because you don't have an Ethernet cable connected, or you haven't got Wi-Fi. So I'm going to show you the solution for that. Obviously, you need to make sure that your motherboard supports Wi-Fi in the first place. This motherboard does. It's clearly marketed as a Wi-Fi one, so make sure that's the case. But what you'll find is in the box, there are a few things that you want to watch out for. Sometimes you might be lucky enough to find a USB thumb drive in the box. And this will be very handy because this most likely has your Wi-Fi drivers on it, which will solve your problem. So stick with me, I'll show you how to install those in a little while using this. You'll also find that there's a Wi-Fi antenna that looks something like this. You'll see it has these gold contacts on it, which basically designed to screw onto the back of the motherboard. It's important that this is installed, otherwise you won't get a good Wi-Fi signal. This screws into the back here, as you can see. Now this motherboard's obviously outside the box. You do it once it's installed in the case fully, and then you screw the antenna into the back of it. You'll find that probably your Bluetooth and Wi-Fi both won't work properly without this screwed in. So it's really important that you find this and install it for this process to work properly, and make sure that's fully installed, and then find somewhere to just pop it on your PC so you can get a good signal. They might find different designs to this. This is a Gigabyte one, for example. This actually just plugs in, just pushes into the back of the motherboard instead of needing to be screwed in, but it's the same sort of logic. It's just an antenna to extend the range and the signal. So you'll find there's a port on the back of the motherboard. You can see a finished product here. Basically plugs into the top there, and once that's seated in there, then you'll get a good signal for the Wi-Fi and it'll work. Hopefully that might solve your problem really easily. Definitely will help with signal, so it's very important to put that in. But once you get to this screen and you find that you're stuck, I'm going to show you the solution for it. So the easiest thing to do, if you can, is to actually plug in an Ethernet cable. So if you've got an Ethernet cable from your router, plug it into the back of the motherboard. That will solve the issues usually most of the time, because the system will identify that it's got an Ethernet connection now, and you can just use that instead. But if you don't have that option, then what you need to do is head over to the Motherboard's website to download the drivers. Now, obviously, you're going to need a separate machine for this, like a laptop or something else. But in a second, I'll show you how to do it with your phone. But what we're looking for is the support section and then the Wi-Fi drivers. So you can see Wi-Fi drivers here and Wi-Fi Bluetooth drivers. Obviously, you need to make sure you're on your relevant Motherboard website. Download those. Now, you can do this on your phone, which makes life a lot easier because it means you don't need to worry about having access to another device like a laptop or a spare PC. You can just head over to the support pages and then follow those steps to download the drivers. You probably want to get the LAN drivers for the Ethernet and Wi-Fi drivers for your Wi-Fi at a minimum, and then you can install those, and I'll show you the process for installing them in a second. But the good thing about doing this on a Google phone or on an Android device is that you can download and extract these files, because you'll find that often come zipped up and compressed. So you need to download them first of all. Then when I go to open the files, open it with Files by Google, and then you get the option to extract. So you can see you can extract this. Now, this is an exe file, which means it's an application. We won't want to run it on the phone. We're not trying to do that. What we're going to use is basically setting the phone up so that it's working as an external drive. So we take the USB-C cable, plug it into the charging port on your phone, plug the other end of that cable into your motherboard, then head over to the settings section on your phone. And what you want to do is look for the USB preferences. Under there, you should have an option here where you want to set it to file transfer mode instead of charging. Then you basically can then use your phone to do this. As an alternative, if you're using an iPhone, I don't know if that will work, so maybe use a laptop, borrow a friend's laptop, or find a spare device that you can download the files on. Then you're going to want to put them onto a USB thumb drive of some sort, an external drive. So as I mentioned, they are compressed and they are zipped up. So what you need to do is download the files first of all, and then basically go into your downloads section. So open up the downloads folder, and then in the downloads folder, right click on the compressed file and click extract all. So you see the option there for extracting all. Then what you want to do is browse and find the USB drive. So you can see a USB here, and that's the thumb drive you want to extract that to. Extract those files onto that drive. And then obviously we're going to then remove that drive from the laptop or other device that you've installed them on. Watch out, this is what we want, a DCH setup file. Obviously it'll be named slightly differently depending on your motherboard, but we're looking for the exe file for the installation there. Install that into the back of the motherboard, plug that in, and then what you should do is then go back to your PC, then hit Shift and F10. This will bring up the command window you can see pops up here. Click on that with your mouse. Make sure you've done that, otherwise you might not be able to do the next step. And what we're going to do here is type in Explorer. If you type in Explorer and then hit Enter, you'll find that Windows Explorer pops up and it allows you to just navigate around and look at files on your system. So click on this PC and then click on your device. So in this case, I'm using my phone, but maybe you'd use the USB drive depending on what you're using for the files. So then you just need to find the driver file. So in this case, the exe file, and run it. And so it's pretty straightforward for the most part. Make sure, obviously, if you're using a USB drive, you haven't got loads of other files on there. It's much clearer if you haven't got loads of other things and you're trying to search for a randomly named file that might not be obvious. If you have any pop-ups like this, just click run on them and yes to extract any of the files that you need to. It might have these extra steps to it. And then if you just wait, you should find that the Wi-Fi driver files will then install on the system. Once that's done, you can then just connect to the Wi-Fi. Assuming you've got your antenna set up as from earlier, you should find it then is pretty straightforward. What I found is I had to close Explorer down, so minimize that, and then close the command prompt down. But then you'll see now the screen has changed, and now I can connect to the Wi-Fi. So obviously entering in your Wi-Fi password and then accessing and connecting to the Wi-Fi, and you'll then be able to go about the process of continuing on with your Windows installation. So it's relatively straightforward in this way, and obviously you've got the options. You can do it with your phone, you can do it with a laptop and a USB stick that way, And so you've got different ways to install the drivers in this instance before you get into Windows and go about the setup process. If, however, you find that this doesn't work for you, there is another way that you can go about this, and another thing that you can do so you can install Windows without needing internet. So there's another tip for you that will be helpful too. Hit Shift and F10, bring up the command prompt, and instead of typing in Explorer, you type in OOBE /bypass NRO. So follow that step and then hit enter. What this will do is it'll actually restart Windows again, so restart your PC. It'll go back into the installation process. But in this instance, once you go through the steps, what you'll find is you can do it now and basically access it so that you can click I don't have internet. Now, obviously, I've already installed the Wi-Fi drivers so you can see those. You won't see that on your screen, but you now have the option to continue with limited setup, which means that you don't need to worry about being connected to the internet and you don't need to worry about logging into your Microsoft account, and you can just create an offline way of doing it. So this then allows you to go about the installation of Windows that way. So this is another option. The Explorer way is the easier way to do it because it basically means you can log into your Microsoft account, which I would recommend doing. But that is an alternative if you want to do it. And you should then find that you're happily in Windows. So hopefully that's sorted that out. Now, you might find there is another problem. You've got a slightly different setup where, for example, your drivers are slightly different. So you might find when you download your wireless drivers, instead of being an exe file that you can run, instead when you extract the files onto your PC or onto your thumb drive, that it's just a list of different system files and DLL files. If you hit the Start menu and then search for Device Manager and then go under Network Adapters, if you find the Wi-Fi one, it usually will have a warning triangle against it to say it's not got a driver. You can then search for the drivers, look for the specific folder on your PC, so go to the download section and find that folder that you've extracted, or alternatively you copy where that is and then paste it into the folder location. You can then choose to update the drivers for your Wi-Fi from that particular folder, and it will look for the relevant files. In my instance, it doesn't work because it's already installed, but you might find this is a good solution. Once you've got drivers installed, I'd recommend using Intel's Driver and Support Assistant. Even if you're not using an Intel system, Intel Wi-Fi is actually present in a lot of different machines. You can use this to make sure you've got the latest Bluetooth drivers and wireless drivers and maybe LAN drivers as well. Once you're in Windows, you can then go and download Gigabyte Control Center and RGB Fusion. RGB Fusion within Control Center allows you to control the RGB lighting of the fans, assuming you set them to that sync mode with the front button. So you can then control the lighting of the fans and the pump and the RGB lighting around the edges. You can choose from various different modes in here, and obviously you can select those, change the colors of them. You'll see everything changes, with the exception of the graphics card, which for some reason I can't get to work properly. But you can see all the BeQuiet fans and the Lian lighting all changes through these various different color profiles. So hopefully this has been a useful guide for you. I realize it's been a really long one. Hopefully you made it all the way here. If you did, I really appreciate you. Thanks very much for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already.